Claire Donovan settled into her first-class seat on Flight 237 with a rare sense of relief that came from knowing she could finally rest. For once, there were no deadlines, no high-stakes briefings, no looming decisions pressing against her mind. She had wrapped up a week of consulting work in Washington, a demanding stretch of days spent advising aviation leaders on safety protocols. It was exhausting, but nothing compared to the years she had once endured in uniform. Now, the hum of the engines seemed to sing a lullaby, coaxing her into a peace she hadn't felt in months. Around her, the polished comfort of first class unfolded like a cocoon. The cabin lights glowed in a warm amber tone, reflecting off crystal glasses perched on trays. The flight attendants moved with seamless efficiency, offering wine refills and neatly plated meals, the kind that looked too delicate to belong on a plane. Claire politely declined. Food could wait. What she needed was sleep. She stretched her long legs under the seat, tugged the thin blanket up to her shoulders, and let her eyes drift closed. To anyone glancing her way, she appeared like any other tired traveler, stylish and self-contained. But beneath that polished exterior lived a history few could guess. Claire Donovan wasn't just another consultant flying home. She had once been Captain Donovan of the United States Air Force. Call sign Ghost Hawk, a name that carried weight in briefing rooms and whispers on bases across continents. Her career had been carved from dangerous skies, stealth missions over volatile regions, rescue operations that seemed impossible until she made them possible, nights where every decision meant lives gained or lost. She had walked away from it all 5 years ago, quietly, without ceremony. People asked why, but Claire had never offered a satisfying answer. She simply said it was time. The truth was more complicated. War left shadows that lingered long after medals were pinned and missions declassified. She had given everything her focus, her loyalty, her youth to the cockpit. But eventually, exhaustion became more than physical. It reached her spirit, demanding an exit. So she transitioned into consulting, sharing her expertise without strapping into a jet. Life was quieter now, predictable, safe, or at least it was supposed to be. She shifted slightly in her seat, pulling the blanket closer as the engine's hum deepened. The soft vibration beneath her feet was oddly comforting, reminding her of calmer flights from her childhood, when her father, a commercial pilot, would explain the mysteries of airplanes in simple, patient tones. She had grown up believing the cockpit was almost magical, a place where chaos met order, where steel wings could defy gravity with precision. That fascination had driven her toward the Air Force, where she discovered that flight was less about magic and more about grit, discipline, and an unshakable nerve under pressure. Claire smiled faintly in her half-sleep, remembering her early days at flight school. She had been underestimated, labeled too calm, too analytical, too quiet to stand out among the bold, competitive cadets. Yet when emergencies struck, it was her steadiness that carried her through. Her instructors noticed. One night during a stormy exercise, she landed a trainer aircraft blind after electrical systems failed, guided only by instinct and memory of terrain. The base commander, a man not given to compliments, had walked into the hangar, clapped her shoulder, and muttered, like a ghost hawk, silent, deadly precise. The name stuck. Now, thousands of miles from that memory, she sat as Ghost Hawk, no longer just Claire. A woman tucked into first class, wearing a navy blazer and flats, her hair tied neatly back. None of the passengers around her had any inkling of the legacy that rested in her past. A businessman 2 seats down tapped at a glowing laptop, spreadsheets dancing across the screen. A young couple whispered over shared headphones, giggling at a movie. Across the aisle, a grandmother knitted patiently, the yarn pooling in her lap like a soft ocean. Everyone existed in their own bubble of routine travel. The flight attendants announced that dinner service was ending. their voices smooth and professional. Claire murmured a polite, "No thank you," when offered dessert, then leaned back once more. Her eyelids grew heavy. The blanket was thin, but it was enough. As she drifted further into sleep, her mind wandered not into nightmares of combat, but into fragments of skies, streaked with sunsets and endless blue. For once, her dreams were peaceful. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly below, a dark canvas broken only by scattered points of moonlight glinting off the water. At 35,000 feet, the aircraft was a speck of metal carving across the sky. Inside, passengers settled into the lull of cruising altitude, their worries set aside for the hours ahead. Claire breathed steadily, unaware of how fragile that calm truly was. The first sign of unease was so subtle it barely registered. A faint vibration rippled through the floor, distinct from the normal hum. The engines pitched slightly lower, then corrected. A businessman frowned and glanced up, then shrugged, returning to his laptop. The grandmother paused her knitting for a beat before resuming. In first class, turbulence was often smoothed away by the sheer comfort of the seats. To Claire, asleep, the shift blended into her dream. Still, somewhere deep in her subconscious, the sensation tugged at her. Years of flying had trained her body to notice every anomaly, every nuance in sound or movement. Even asleep, her instincts stirred, whispering warnings her conscious mind couldn't yet hear. The plane continued forward, its lights cutting across the endless night. In the cockpit, however, tension was beginning to rise. A warning light blinked, ignored at first as a minor glitch, then followed by another and another. The captain adjusted knobs, his calm expression masking concern. The co-pilot checked systems twice, his brow furrowing. They didn't yet know the scope of the problem, but they knew enough. Something was not right. Back in first class, Claire shifted again, her breathing uneven, as if her body already sensed the storm building beyond her rest. The world around her was still calm, passengers sipping drinks, attendants smiling politely, but the first threads of chaos had already begun to weave themselves into the night. And Claire Donovan, Ghost Hawk, was about to be pulled from her quiet anonymity back into the role she thought she had left behind forever. The first jolt was subtle, almost like an invisible hand nudging the aircraft from below. A few passengers glanced up, blinking from drowsy comfort, then returned to screens and novels. Turbulence, they thought. Nothing unusual. After all, anyone who had flown more than once understood that occasional bumps were part of the experience. Even the flight attendants, brisk and polished, moved without hesitation, clearing trays with practiced smiles. But seconds later, the subtle jolt became a violent shudder. The plane lurched sideways, rattling glasses and sending silverware clattering against plates. Gasps filled the cabin. Claire's eyes snapped open, the deep calm of her sleep instantly replaced with sharp awareness. Her hands gripped the armrests instinctively as muscle memory screamed through her veins. This wasn't simple turbulence. Something deeper, more insidious, was wrong. A hollow thump echoed through the fuselage, followed by the sound of bins overhead snapping loose. A roller bag spilled into the aisle, bouncing against an attendant's ankle. She staggered but forced a tight smile, crouching quickly to grab it as passengers stared wide-eyed. Her composure was impressive, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. The lights flickered. For a moment, darkness cloaked the cabin, broken only by the eerie glow of seatbelt signs. Children whimpered. Someone muttered a prayer. The businessman beside Claire slammed his laptop shut, his face suddenly pale. The young couple across the aisle clutched each other's arms, their movie forgotten. Claire's gaze swept the space around her, reading the room like she once read a cockpit mid-mission. Fear was contagious, and it was spreading quickly. Then came the voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen. The captain's tone was flat at first, the practiced cadence of someone who wanted passengers calm. But halfway through, his words cracked. We are experiencing severe system difficulties. He paused, breathing audible through the static. Remain seated. Fasten seatbelts. Flight attendants. Secure the cabin. The intercom clicked off, leaving only the roar of engines and the uneven rattle of a metal body under strain. Claire exhaled slowly, though her pulse thudded hard against her ribs. Severe system difficulties. She knew what that meant. Not turbulence. Not weather. Something mechanical. Something critical. In her years flying combat aircraft, she had heard those same words in her headset calm tones, masking looming disaster. And in every instance, those difficulties carried the same brutal truth. Either a crew solved them within minutes, or the outcome was catastrophic. Across the cabin, people shifted restlessly, voices rising in anxious tones. A man called for a flight attendant. His words rushed and clipped. Another began fumbling with the oxygen mask above his seat, tugging until the plastic hissed and dangled. The attendants hurried, but their smiles were brittle now, their reassurances hollow. They, too, had heard the edge in the captain's voice. Claire's body leaned forward without thought, her instincts sparking like flint against steel. Her training whispered in her ear, the old cadence of instructors. Read the environment. Anticipate. Stay ahead of a failure. But she caught herself, gripping the armrest tighter. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't at the controls. She was just a passenger. Wasn't she? Another violent dip yanked the plane downward, weightlessness pressing stomachs to throats. Screams erupted. Cups launched into the air, scattering soda and wine across the cabin. Claire braced herself, teeth clenched, eyes darting automatically to gauge altitude by the shift of light through the window. 35,000 feet was bleeding away. The businessman beside her swore under his breath, fumbling for the seatbelt buckle that was already secure. What the hell is happening? He demanded, not at her in particular, but at the universe itself. Claire didn't answer. She couldn't, not yet. Then the cockpit door cracked open. Just for a second. It was enough. The co-pilot stepped halfway into the aisle, his face pale and drawn tight. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly, urgently, as though searching for something or someone. Claire's breath caught. His gaze landed on her. Recognition flickered, sharp and immediate, like a switch flipping in his memory. He knew her. His jaw tightened, and his voice rang out, louder than the chaos of passengers and the roar of engines. Ghost Hawk. The call sign struck the air like a lightning bolt. The name reverberated against the walls, confusing those who heard it, but igniting a spark deep in Claire's chest. Passengers turned toward her, brows furrowed, eyes questioning. Ghost Hawk? Who was Ghost Hawk? Claire froze. She hadn't heard that name in years, not in the silence of her civilian office, not in polite conferences or quiet hotel rooms. Ghost Hawk belonged to another world, another lifetime. Yet here, at 30,000 feet with a failing aircraft, the name snapped back into existence, as if it had been waiting in the shadows all along. She swallowed hard, pulse hammering. Her mind leapt backward, unspooling images she had fought to leave behind. Tracer fire streaking across black skies, a cockpit filled with alarms, her hands moving steady on controls, while chaos screamed in her headset. Missions where she was the last hope for survival. Missions where Ghost Hawk meant salvation. The co-pilot's voice cut through her spiraling memory. "We need you," he shouted, desperation raw in every syllable. His face, strained but hopeful, told her everything. The crew was overwhelmed. The systems were failing, and they were out of options. Passengers around her murmured in confusion, whispers darting like sparks. Who's Ghost Talk? Is he talking to her? What's happening? Claire's body felt suspended between two worlds, the civilian life she had built and the ghost of her past rising to reclaim her. She had boarded this flight as a consultant, anonymous, invisible. But now the mask was gone. The co-pilot had torn it away with one word. And deep inside, under layers of denial and distance, she felt something awaken. Her old self. The part of her that didn't freeze under pressure, that didn't wait for orders. The part that knew chaos intimately and could bend it into order with steady hands and sharp decisions. Ghost Talk. Claire inhaled slowly, her decision forming as surely as if it had already been written. She could stay in her seat, let the trained crew handle it, and pray they landed safely. Or she could rise risking everything, even her own hard-won peace, to take control of the storm. The aircraft shuddered again, lights dimming, passengers screaming. The choice was made for her. Ghost Talk was needed, and Ghost Talk would answer. The co-pilot's cry still rang in the air, sharp and electric. Ghost Talk. We need Ghost Talk now. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. Passengers stared, blinking in disbelief. A name like that didn't belong on a commercial airliner. Ghost Talk wasn't a passenger, wasn't someone sipping sparkling water in first class. The whispers spread like wildfire across the cabin. Who's Ghost Talk? Did he mean her? Is this some kind of code? Eyes turned toward Claire. She felt the weight of dozens of gazes pressing against her. Curious, terrified, desperate for answers. She sat rigid in her seat, jaw clenched, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. The businessman beside her whispered, "He's talking to you, isn't he? What does that mean?" She didn't reply. Words weren't ready yet. The co-pilot's eyes locked with hers, full of urgency, pleading. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't confused. He knew exactly who she was. Somehow, her call sign had survived in the back channels of aviation legend, passed down like a myth to younger generations of pilots. She had forgotten that her name carried echoes, stories whispered in training rooms, examples of impossible missions that somehow succeeded. Her body resisted, torn between two lives. The consultant in her, the quiet, civilian Claire Donovan, wanted to remain seated, to shake her head and insist it wasn't her problem. She had given her service already. She had walked away. But the Air Force officer buried within her, the one who had flown through storms of fire and chaos, stirred awake like a predator sensing prey. Ghost Talk. The name wasn't just a label. It was a mantle. And now it was being demanded of her. Another violent lurch threw the plane sideways. Passengers screamed. A drink cart rattled loose and slammed against a seat, scattering bottles across the aisle. A child cried uncontrollably as her mother pulled her close. The oxygen masks above their heads shook in their compartments, as if waiting to fall. Claire stood. The businessman gawked at her. "What are you doing?" "Sit down." But her posture was calm, steady. Her movements were precise, deliberate, like a soldier walking into formation. She pulled the blanket from her lap and let it fall to the floor. Every eye tracked her as she stepped into the aisle. Murmurs rose, blending fear with hope. The co-pilot didn't hesitate. He swung the cockpit door wider, gesturing frantically. "Now!" he barked. His voice was thin with strain, but his eyes lit with relief as she began moving forward. A flight attendant intercepted her halfway down the aisle, palms out. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. She's Ghost Talk," the co-pilot snapped, his tone cutting like steel. "She's cleared," the attendant faltered, confusion flashing across her face. But when she glanced at Claire, something in her calm, commanding gaze made her step aside. The passengers closest to the aisle shifted back, clearing a path as if some instinct told them she belonged up front. Claire walked steadily, her heartbeat strong but controlled. Each step felt like crossing a threshold she thought she'd left behind forever. She remembered other walks into mission briefings, into cockpits before dangerous sorties, into rooms where she alone was expected to carry the impossible. It was the same weight now, pressing against her shoulders, demanding she accept it again. She reached the cockpit door. The co-pilot stepped aside, letting her in. The sudden shift from the chaotic cabin to the cramped, glowing cockpit was jarring. Red and amber lights flashed across the instrument panels, alarms blaring in relentless rhythm. The captain sat hunched forward, hands trembling slightly on the yoke, his face pale with sweat. He turned as Claire entered, disbelief flickering across his features. "Who the hell?" he began, but the co-pilot cut him off. "Captain, this is Claire Donovan. Ghost Hawk. She—" The captain's eyes widened. Recognition dawned. He had heard the name. Every veteran pilot had. His doubt faltered, replaced by the faintest thread of hope. Claire slid into the jump seat, movements fluid, practiced. Her hands gripped the edge of the console as she scanned the chaos before her. Warning lights screamed, electrical system compromised, autopilot disengaged, navigation unreliable. She read it all in seconds, her mind assembling the puzzle with the speed of long-forged instinct. Her voice was calm, commanding. "Talk to me. What failed first?" The captain swallowed hard. Main bus shorted. Lost autopilot, partial nav failure. Backup systems unstable. She's fighting neon descent. Claire nodded, eyes flicking across gauges. Fuel status? 3 hours, maybe less. But if we keep losing altitude, we won't, she cut him off, her tone absolute. Her focus didn't waver. She leaned toward the controls, pointing. Reroute auxiliary through here. Shut down non-essential loads galley, cabin lights, everything. We need every watt for flight systems. The co-pilot scrambled to comply. His movements were quick but clumsy, nerves shaking his precision. Claire steadied him with her voice, crisp and clear. Slow down. One system at a time. Breathe. You know this. He inhaled sharply, nodding, regaining composure. The captain glanced at her again, incredulous. When was the last time you flew? Doesn't matter, she replied, eyes locked on the panel. I remember enough. The truth was, it had been years since she sat in a cockpit under pressure. Years since her hands had guided a vessel through near impossible odds. But her body remembered. Muscle memory didn't vanish. It simply waited dormant, ready to reawaken when called. And it was awake now. Behind her, the muffled panic of passengers seeped through the door. She imagined their faces terrified, clinging to strangers, desperate for someone, anyone, to lead them through this. She couldn't let them down. Stabilize pitch, she ordered, her voice sharp. Use manual trim. Don't fight her, guide her. The captain obeyed, his movements uncertain at first, but growing steadier under her guidance. The plane's nose lifted slightly, the violent shaking easing into a rough but manageable rhythm. The alarms didn't stop, but for the first time since the crisis began, control felt possible. Claire exhaled slowly, her mind sharpening with every second. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She wasn't even Claire Donovan, consultant. She was Ghost Hawk again, calm, relentless, unshakable in the storm. And the storm was only beginning. The cockpit was a storm of flashing lights and shrill alarms, a space that felt less like the steady command center of a commercial jet, and more like a battlefield. Red and amber warnings blinked across the panels, overlapping in chaotic rhythm. The captain gripped the yoke with both hands, sweat dripping down his temple. His jaw was clenched tight, but his movements betrayed the tremor of panic. The co-pilot scrambled across the controls, flipping switches, calling out status checks, his voice cracking as he did. And then there was Claire. Her entry into the cockpit shifted the air. It was subtle, almost invisible, but both men felt it. Her presence carried a gravity that pushed back against the panic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bark orders the way a drill instructor would. But the precision in her tone, the calm sharpness of each word, forced the space into alignment. "Status," she said. The captain rattled off their failures. Primary bus shorted. Autopilot disengaged. Altitude unstable. Nav unreliable. "We're fighting pitch and roll drift? Fuel?" she asked. 3 hours. Maybe less if we keep struggling. Her eyes swept the panel again. She absorbed the details quickly, translating alarms into action plans. To anyone else, the blaring sounds were a wall of chaos. To her, they were just voices waiting to be silenced one at a time. "All right," she said evenly. "First, cut non-essential power. Shut down cabin lighting, galley systems, seat warmers, everything you can live without. Funnel what's left into flight controls and comms." The co-pilot jumped to comply. His hands shook, fumbling for the switches, but her voice steadied him. "Breathe," she instructed softly, never taking her eyes off the instruments. "Don't rush. One switch at a time. Think of the flow." He exhaled sharply, nodded, and his movements grew smoother. Systems dimmed behind them as the cabin lighting dropped into low emergency mode. Passengers would be panicking at the sudden darkness, but Claire knew it was necessary. Every watt counted. Next, she leaned toward the captain. "You're overcorrecting. Stop fighting the plane. Guide her. Feel her weight. She's not responding cleanly." He argued, voice tight. "She doesn't have to," Claire replied. "You just need to ride the rhythm. Trust her. Trust yourself." She rested one steady hand on the panel, her eyes locked on the artificial horizon. The plane's nose dipped slightly, threatening another uncontrolled descent. Claire's voice cut through. "Trim manually. Don't yank the yoke." Small adjustments. The captain hesitated, then obeyed. Slowly, painfully, the horizon leveled. The nose lifted fraction by fraction. The violent shudder eased into a rough but controlled vibration. It wasn't smooth flying, but it was survivable. The alarms didn't stop. The flashing lights didn't end. But for the first time since the crisis began, there was a sliver of stability. The co-pilot looked back at her in awe. "You've done this before?" Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer. Her eyes remained on the instruments. Memories pressed at the edge of her mind missions, where her hands had moved just like this, in cockpits rattling with warning lights, adrenaline pounding, lives hanging in the balance. She had thought she left it all behind. But here she was again, exactly where she swore she would never be. She pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about her past. This was about the 200 souls behind that door, strapped into their seats, whispering prayers, clinging to strangers. Their lives depended on precision now, and precision was her gift. "Okay," she said firmly. "Auxiliary power's online. That buys us time, but it won't last. We need to stabilize altitude and get vectors for emergency descent. Co-pilot, call ATC. Declare Mayday. Request nearest viable runway." The younger man swallowed, nodding. His voice shook as he pressed the COM switch, but her presence anchored him. He repeated her instructions word for word, tone steadier each time he spoke. Claire glanced at the captain again. His eyes darted between her and the controls, torn between pride and fear. He was a man used to command, but right now, His ship was slipping out of his grasp. Claire could see the war inside him, the instinct to defend his authority against the crushing reality that he needed help. "You're not losing control," she told him quietly, almost like a confidant. "You're sharing it. Trust me." His knuckles whitened against the yoke, but after a long pause, he gave a sharp nod. "All right. What's next?" Her eyes flicked to the failing navigation display. "Next, we find out just how blind we are." She reached for the auxiliary systems, fingers moving with muscle memory, rerouting data through remaining channels. Half the displays remained dark, but a few flickered with shaky numbers. It wasn't enough for a textbook approach, but it was something. She called out readings, her voice clear and confident. The captain repeated them, adjusting course carefully. The co-pilot relayed updates to a TC. Slowly, a fragile chain of order began to form in the chaos. Inside, Claire's chest burned with the weight of adrenaline. Her hands moved on instinct, but her mind battled the ghosts of her past. She remembered nights over hostile skies, when her call sign echoed through comms as the last hope of a failing mission. She remembered the silence after each landing, the emptiness of knowing she had survived while others hadn't. And she remembered the moment she swore she was finished, that she wouldn't live like that anymore. Yet here she was, pulled back. Ghost Hawk again. The cockpit steadied, the chaos now threaded into a rhythm. But Claire knew better than to relax. This was only the beginning. Systems were still fragile, navigation uncertain, and the runway was far away. She looked at the men beside her, their eyes locked on her as though she were the captain now. She hadn't asked for command. But sometimes command wasn't given, it was taken when the moment demanded it. And the moment demanded Ghost Hawk. The cockpit felt like a furnace, a small chamber of blinking red lights and stale air that burned with tension. Claire's pulse raced, but her voice stayed sharp, slicing through the chaos with authority. She wasn't a passenger in 2A anymore. She wasn't a consultant heading to a quiet business meeting. She was Ghost Hawk, whether she liked it or not. "Reroute auxiliary power through Busby," she ordered, her tone flat, unwavering. "Bypass the fried circuits. Don't waste time trying to repair, just cut and redirect." A co-pilot nodded frantically, his hands moving across the panel. His training had never prepared him for total system collapse. But Claire's instructions were crisp, as if she had rehearsed this 1,000 times. "Now kill hydraulics to non-essential surfaces," she continued. "Stabilizers and rudder priority." The captain glanced at her, sweat glistening on his forehead. "That's risky. We lose redundancy." "You've already lost redundancy," Claire shot back. "This buys you control." Her tone silenced him. He obeyed, his trembling fingers moving with mechanical obedience. For the first time since the nightmare began, the yoke stiffened into something manageable, not the twitching, unpredictable beast it had been. The plane responded not perfectly, but predictably. Claire exhaled through her nose. Progress. But outside the cockpit, progress was invisible. The cabin had devolved into chaos. Oxygen masks swung wildly as passengers clutched them, sobbing and gasping. Overhead bins hung half open, luggage spilled into the aisles. A child cried inconsolably in the middle rows, her small voice piercing the roar of fear. Flight attendants moved desperately between seats, trying to calm people, but their voices were drowned by the panic. One man shouted in anger, accusing the crew of incompetence. Another tried to force open the lavatory door, convinced the tail was failing. Whispers of death rippled through the cabin like wildfire. The lead flight attendant, Maria, caught sight of Claire disappearing into the cockpit earlier. She had no idea who the woman was, but she clung to the hope that Claire was more than she seemed. Now, as she braced herself against a galley wall, Maria whispered a silent prayer. "Whoever you are, save us." Back in the cockpit, Claire blocked out the faint sounds of terror bleeding through the reinforced door. She couldn't afford distraction. "Check altitude," she demanded. 28,000, dropping steady at 500 feet per minute, the co-pilot reported. "Good. We'll ride it. Keep the descent shallow." "Buy time." Her eyes flicked across the dimly lit instruments, processing. This wasn't just flying a crippled jet. It was a battle against mathematics, fuel, and physics. She calculated silently, weighing risks like she once had under anti-aircraft fire. Ghost Hawk. The words slipped from the captain's lips before he caught himself. He hadn't meant to say it aloud. It was just the name echoing in his memory, something the co-pilot had blurted in desperation earlier. But saying it again gave it weight. Claire stiffened. The name wasn't hers anymore. She had buried it with the uniform she'd folded neatly and locked away. But in this cockpit, with lives on the line, the ghost had returned. Her jaw clenched. "Focus on the instruments, Captain." He nodded, chastened. But a flicker of hope lingered in his eyes now. "Oh, power stabilized," the co-pilot called out. "We've got partial comes back. Good. Patch ATC through. We'll need vectors to the nearest strip that can take this bird." The co-pilot's voice wavered as he pressed the com switch. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 237. Heavy system failure. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest runway capable of emergency landing." The reply crackled with static, but the ground controller's voice came through. "Flight 237, Roger, mayday. Stand by. We're clearing airspace." Claire's shoulders loosened slightly. Not relief, never relief, but acknowledgement that one piece of the puzzle was in place. She turned back to the captain. "Now listen carefully. We've stabilized, but you're still bleeding altitude. We'll need manual control all the way down. No autopilot, no auto trim. Every inch will be muscle." The captain nodded grimly. "Understood." She leaned closer, her eyes locking onto his. "That means you cannot panic. The plane follows you. If you lose yourself, she will too." The words struck deep. For the first time, the captain's trembling steadied. He tightened his grip, but now with purpose. Claire shifted to the co-pilot. "Monitor instruments. Call out every 100-foot drop. I want eyes on everything: fuel, hydraulics, cabin pressure." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The ma'am caught her. For a second, she wasn't in a passenger jet. She was back in her fighter, squadron comes in her ear, wingmen waiting for her voice. The battlefield had changed, but the rhythm was the same. The cockpit steadied again, the hum of order threading through chaos. But inside Claire, the storm raged. She remembered the last time she'd landed an aircraft in failure. A 10-shot to ribbons, engines coughing smoke, alarms screaming. She had limped it back, barely, her squadron trailing flames behind her. She'd made it, but not all of them had. That night haunted her, the reason she walked away, the reason she never flew again. Now fate had thrown her back into the fire. And she could feel the weight of 200 lives pressing harder than any mission she'd flown before. She forced the memory down, bearing it. Focus, always focus. "All right," she said finally, her voice like steel. "We've stopped the bleeding. Now let's figure out how to walk again." The captain glanced sideways. "You make it sound simple." Claire's lips quirked into the faintest ghost of a smile. "It's never simple, but it's possible." Behind the cockpit door, the cabin remained a tempest of fear. Passengers clutched their masks, whispered final messages into their phones, or stared blankly into the dark. Yet unknowingly, they had already crossed from the brink of disaster into the fragile hope of survival. Because Ghost Talk had taken the stick again, and she wasn't letting go. The descent was steady, but fragile. Each 100 feet ticked away like sand slipping through an hourglass, and Claire knew they had little margin for error. The plane was stable now. Yes, but stability was an illusion, temporary, brittle. A single surge, a single electrical misfire, and everything could unravel again. Fuel remaining? She asked, her eyes locked on the flickering displays. The co-pilot checked, voice tense. 2 hours at this rate? Maybe less, Claire nodded. Enough for one good shot, maybe two. But there wouldn't be two. They'd get one attempt at landing, and if it failed, the outcome would be catastrophic. Captain, how's she handling? Claire asked. The captain flexed his hands around the yoke. His knuckles were pale, but his voice held steady now. Sluggish, but responsive. She's not fighting me like before. Good. That means she trusts you. The captain's lips twitched. It wasn't a smile exactly, but a faint spark of confidence. Claire caught it. She had learned long ago that even the smallest ember of courage mattered in moments like this. All right, Claire continued, her tone calm but commanding. We'll need vectors for an emergency landing. No fancy maneuvers. Straight in, wide approach, minimal stress. The co-pilot nodded, relaying their status over the comms. The controller's voice crackled back. Flight 237. You are cleared for priority landing. Nearest viable is Denver International, runway 34 left. Weather clear. Emergency crews on standby. Claire leaned closer, processing the information. Denver meant mountains. Altitude would complicate the descent, but the runway was long and built for heavy aircraft. It was their best chance. Roger, she replied smoothly, taking the comms herself now. Flight 237, diverting to Denver. Request straight-in approach vectors. The controller hesitated for a fraction of a second perhaps, surprised by the calm, authoritative female voice. But he didn't question. Roger, Flight 237. Maintain current heading. Descend to 18,000. Expect vectors in 10. Claire replaced the handset. All right. We've got a plan. But the cockpit wasn't her only battlefield. Beyond the reinforced door, the cabin trembled with fear. Passengers clutched their seats, knuckles white. Some sobbed quietly into their masks. Others whispered frantic prayers. And still others sat in stunned silence, faces pale, eyes vacant. The child who had cried earlier was quiet now, worn out, her small head resting against her mother's chest. The mother rocked her gently, murmuring words the girl probably couldn't hear over the hum of the engines. Flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, faces composed, but voices strained. They repeated reassurances, helped passengers with masks, and tried to project calm they didn't truly feel. Maria, the lead, kept glancing toward the cockpit door. She hadn't seen Claire since she entered, but she clung to the belief that the mysterious woman was holding them all together. Back in the cockpit, Claire reviewed systems again. She knew she couldn't afford to rely on luck. Every variable needed to be managed. Hydraulics? She asked. Stable, the co-pilot answered quickly. But pressures are low. Keep monitoring. If we lose them again, you'll have to go manual backup. Be ready. The co-pilot nodded, swallowing hard. Claire turned to the captain. Listen carefully. The approach is yours. I'll call corrections. Trust me, follow my voice, and we'll put her down. The captain's throat worked. He nodded once. It was then that Claire felt the weight of 200 unseen faces pressing against her. She had flown missions before combat sorties, where the stakes were high, but this was different. These weren't soldiers who had signed up for risk. These were families, business travelers, students. Innocent lives thrust into a fight they never asked for. And every one of them was depending on her. A flicker of memory hit her. A night over hostile airspace, tracer fire slicing the dark sky, her squadron scattered. She had led them through with voice commands, steady and unshakable, guiding them home. Some made it. Others didn't. Their names still haunted her. She shook the memory off. This wasn't then. This was now. And she would not lose a single soul if she could help it. "Captain," she said firmly, pulling him back from his silent struggle with the yoke. "Don't fight the plane. Guide her. You're not forcing her down. You're bringing her home." He nodded, his breathing steadier now. The co-pilot suddenly spoke. Cabin pressures dipping again. Oxygen reserves holding, but passengers are reporting dizziness. Claire's mind calculated quickly. It wasn't lethal yet, but it meant the cabin atmosphere was weakening. Fear would spike again. "Get the attendants on comms," Claire ordered. "Tell them to reassure passengers oxygen is stable. No technical talk. Just calm. Keep them focused on breathing." The co-pilot relayed the message. A moment later, the cabin intercom clicked, and Maria's composed voice filled the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen, oxygen levels are safe. Please remain seated with masks on. We are preparing for a safe landing." It wasn't the full truth, but it was the right truth, the one people needed to hear. Claire refocused on her instruments. The runway was still distant, but vectors would come soon. The mountain terrain worried her. Sudden downdrafts could upset their fragile balance. She would need constant vigilance. Minutes dragged. Every second was measured in heartbeats and blinking warnings. But slowly, like a ship turning in rough seas, order began to overtake chaos. The controller's voice finally returned. "Flight 237. Turn left heading 270. Descend to 14,000. You are cleared straight in for runway 34 left." Claire confirmed. She turned to the captain. "Here we go. Follow heading 270. Smooth inputs." Let her respond. The captain complied, and the massive jet shifted, growing as it adjusted course. Claire's hands hovered near the controls, not to take over, but to guide. Her eyes flicked from instrument to horizon, scanning, processing, anticipating. She was in her element, even if part of her hated it. The cabin lights flickered again, plunging everything into momentary darkness, before emergency strips glowed faintly along the aisles. Gasps echoed from passengers, but the engines continued to roar. Claire's jaw tightened. Another reminder of how thin their margin was. "Stay with me," she whispered under her breath, not to the crew, not to the passengers, but to the plane itself. Machines, she had always believed, carried a soul of their own, and this one was fighting to live. She turned back to the captain. "You've got this," she said firmly. 1 mile at a time. 1 breath at a time. Trust the rhythm. And though alarms still flickered and tension still burned, the cockpit had transformed. What had been chaos was now command. What had been panic was now discipline. Because Ghost Hawk was here. And Ghost Hawk never lost a fight in the sky. The runway appeared far below, like a silver strip in the night, lights blinking insistently through the darkness. Claire's eyes tracked it with precision, each marker a lifeline for the aircraft struggling above. Every inch counted, every adjustment measured against physics, speed, and altitude. The plane was stable now, but stability was fragile, like a taut wire stretched over a chasm. One wrong movement, one miscalculation, and everything could unravel. "Align with glide path," Claire instructed, her voice calm but absolute. "Flaps 20, landing gear down." Slow and steady. The captain's hands moved obediently, flexing on the yoke with deliberate caution. Each input sent a ripple through the fuselage. Each correction had to be precise. The engines groaned in protest, but responded. Flaps extended. "Gear down," the co-pilot confirmed, his voice trembling, though steadier than before. The cabin was tense. Passengers clutched seatbelts like lifelines, knuckles white, eyes wide. Children whimpered softly, clinging to parents' arms. The flight attendants moved through the aisles as best they could, offering whispered reassurances, their own fear masked behind professional masks. Claire focused on the instruments, the glowing runway lights, and the subtle shifts of the aircraft's frame. Years of experience in combat cockpits flashed across her mind, but this was different. The stakes were civilian lives, hundreds of them, all trusting her voice, even if they didn't know her name. Maintain airspeed, she instructed. 30 knots above stall. Don't overcorrect. Smooth as your friend. The captain nodded, jaw tight, concentrating. The plane's nose dipped slightly as turbulence gusted unexpectedly, a sudden downdraft threatening their fragile glide. Hold her steady, Claire commanded. Her hands hovered near the controls, ready to guide but careful not to override. The yoke shuddered under the captain's grip. The plane responded slowly, fighting against gravity and damaged hydraulics. In the cabin, the faint hum of engines was replaced by the clatter of loose items and the quiet, tense breathing of 200 passengers. Glasses rattled in trays. A soda can rolled across the floor, striking a seat. The youngest child, eyes wide, murmured, "Are we going to crash?" The mother whispered back, trying to mask her own terror. "No, honey, we're fine. Just hold on." Claire ignored the peripheral chaos. Focus was all that mattered now. Each second demanded calculation, anticipation, and nerves like steel. Approaching runway threshold. "Reduce throttle gradually," she said, eyes flicking between instruments and the glowing lights outside. 300 feet, 200, 100. The co-pilot called out. "Altitude decreasing too fast. We need to flare." Claire leaned closer. "Flare gently. Don't lift too early, let her feel the runway. Keep control. Trust the lift." The plane dipped lower. Sparks flared as the landing gear scraped across rough tarmac. The cabin trembled violently. Screams erupted, followed by gasps. A tray table tipped, clattering against a seat. Oxygen masks shook. But the plane held. "Steady. Apply reverse thrust gradually. Keep wings level," Claire instructed. The yoke shifted slightly as the captain obeyed. The engines groaned, and responded as braking systems fought friction and momentum. Outside, fire trucks and emergency crews lined the runway, sirens screaming. Their presence reassured Claire. They had backup, but she didn't rely on it. All control was in the cockpit. All life was in her hands. The plane skidded along the runway, shuddering with each tire rotation. Sparks flew where metal scraped asphalt. Flaps strained, hydraulics groaned. The passengers gripped their seats, as if the entire structure depended on their own strength. "Keep her straight," Claire yelled, voice carrying authority over the roar. "Don't let her veer." The captain's knuckles whitened. Every muscle in his body tensed. Each adjustment felt like life or death. The plane veered slightly, then straightened under careful corrections. "Almost there," Claire murmured, though the cockpit remained alive with alarms and warning lights. "Hold until full stop. You've got this." The tires screeched, sparks danced along the runway, and the plane shuddered violently for the final stretch. The cabin erupted into screams, cries, and prayers. Then a collective release as the engines slowed and the momentum finally ceased. Silence fell. Not complete silence, engines idled. Alarms blinked, but the chaos had ended. The plane trembled gently, finally settled. 200 passengers exhaled in unison, some shaking, some weeping, some hugging strangers they had never known. Claire remained in the jump seat, pulse racing, yet her face calm, commanding. She had guided them all through the impossible. Her body felt spent, every muscle trembling with the residual adrenaline of hours at the edge of catastrophe. The co-pilot turned to her, eyes wide, voice trembling. You saved us. All of us." The captain, sweat-soaked and pale, nodded slowly. I don't know how to thank you." "I don't think words are enough." Claire allowed herself a faint nod. "Just take care of them now. They're safe." In the cabin, passengers began to stir, realization slowly dawning. Survivors hugged, cried, whispered thanks to strangers. Children clung to parents, still dazed, but alive. Flight attendants guided them carefully, their professional composure giving way to genuine relief. One elderly man stumbled toward Claire, eyes wide with gratitude. You kept us alive. How can we ever repay you?" Claire shook her head. "You don't. Just live." The runway lights stretched behind her, a corridor of salvation. Emergency crews approached cautiously, but she already knew the hardest part was over. The aircraft had obeyed. Her voice had commanded it. Ghost Hawk had flown again. Yet inside, Claire felt a familiar weight. Relief mingled with exhaustion, adrenaline still thrumming through every nerve. She had faced death in the skies countless times, but never with 200 innocent lives. Never with so much at stake for people who had no idea who she was, yet had implicitly trusted her. She glanced around the cockpit one last time. The captain and co-pilot met her gaze. In that look was a recognition she hadn't sought, respect, awe, and silent acknowledgement of what had just occurred. And then she rose, quietly, stepping toward the door. Ghost Hawk's work here was done. For now. The cabin awaited, alive with raw emotion, and Claire braced herself for the final step, returning to anonymity in a world that had briefly seen the legend she had tried to leave behind. The plane was still. The danger had passed. 200 lives had been saved. And somewhere deep inside, Ghost Hawk exhaled. The cabin doors opened slowly, and the low roar of emergency vehicles met the passengers' ears. Fluorescent lights from fire trucks and ambulances cut through the dim night, casting long, sharp shadows across the tarmac. People began to stand, tentative at first, some swaying from adrenaline, exhaustion, or both. Flight attendants guided passengers in orderly lines, though orderly was a relative term after hours of terror. Claire remained in the cockpit a moment longer, observing the slow exodus of lives she had just preserved. Her fingers lingered on the yoke, eyes scanning the instruments one final time. They were still alive. Every single one of them. That fact alone, cold and undeniable, brought a small, silent relief. The first passengers emerged, blinking in the harsh light. Some wept openly, clutching hands. Others hugged strangers as though instinct demanded human connection. Children clung to parents, their earlier terror replaced by quiet curiosity and lingering unease. Across the tarmac, emergency crews moved efficiently, placing reflective cones and guiding vehicles. A gentle hum of relief began to spread through the crowd, a slow, pulsing heartbeat of gratitude and survival. A woman, her hair disheveled and mascara running, paused mid-step. Her eyes locked on the cockpit. Claire noticed her glance, the silent, unspoken question lingering. Who saved us? She didn't answer. Ghost Hawk didn't need applause. Ghost Hawk never did. She rose, brushing imaginary dust from her clothes, and slipped through the small space behind the seats, moving toward the exit. The co-pilot caught her eye. "Wait," he called softly, hesitating. I just want to say..." His voice faltered. Words failed him. He swallowed, gesturing toward the cabin. "You kept everyone alive. You? You're a legend." Claire inclined her head slightly. No words were necessary. She had given them life, not explanations. Her reputation existed in whispers, stories passed along in military circles. Here, in civilian life, it was invisible, but no less real. A captain approached. His face was pale, lined with exhaustion and awe. "I've flown for decades," he said quietly, almost to himself. Never like this. "I don't know your name, but you—" He stopped, shaking his head. "You saved us." "I'm Claire Donovan," she said softly, almost a whisper, though it felt like speaking another lifetime. Recognition sparked, faint but undeniable, in his eyes. Yet there was no ceremony, no fanfare. Claire had already moved on. Life had demanded action, and action alone defined her. Outside, the media was already assembling. The flashing lights of cameras and microphones punctuated the night sky. A few reporters pushed forward, desperate for a name, a face, a narrative to attach to the miraculous survival of Flight 237. Claire kept her gaze forward, head low, moving past the crowd without pause. Heroism, she had learned long ago, did not require witnesses. Yet the passengers, even amidst exhaustion, began to murmur the name that had passed through the cockpit. Ghost Hawk. It was almost reverent. A name born from stories, now whispered in awe by civilians who had never imagined it existed. Claire walked briskly, blending into the background of emergency crews, passengers, and crew members. She was part of the world again, but a world forever changed by what had just occurred in the skies above. A child, small and frightened, tugged at a flight attendant's sleeve, pointing toward the cockpit. "The lady?" "She saved us," the girl said, wide-eyed. The flight attendant smiled gently. Yes, she did." Claire's footsteps faltered for a fraction of a second. Not for recognition, not for praise, but for the humanity of it, the realization that the world still needed heroes, even if the heroes themselves preferred invisibility. At the edge of the tarmac, police officers and airport officials began taking statements. Survivors huddled together, speaking in low, emotional tones, recounting moments of terror, whispers of courage, and prayers answered. Every story led back to one unseen figure, the woman in first class who had vanished into the cockpit, who had assumed command, who had saved lives with steady hands and unshakable resolve. Claire paused, finally letting herself inhale. The weight of adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by exhaustion that ran deep into her bones. She had been Ghost Hawk today. She had faced a storm of metal, fear, and probability, and emerged victorious. 200 people had survived because she had chosen action over hesitation, command over passivity. And yet, the quiet voice inside her whispered, "This isn't the life you left behind. This isn't the life you chose." She allowed herself one small smile. Maybe not the life she wanted, but the life she was needed in. That, she realized, was enough. Across the tarmac, emergency crews were finishing their checks. Passengers slowly moved to buses that would take them to terminals. Reporters still jostled for glimpses, cameras flashing, microphones extending into the air. Claire ducked her head, invisible in plain sight, fading into the crowd. A faint voice reached her ears. "Thank you, truly. You're incredible." She didn't answer. Not yet. Her anonymity was a shield. Ghost Hawk didn't seek praise. Ghost Hawk existed in the act itself. And this act, this night, had ended with 200 lives preserved. That was all that mattered. As she walked away, her thoughts drifted. The adrenaline of flight still pulsed faintly in her veins. The hum of engines, the panic of passengers, the trembling of the crew, all of it replayed in her mind. She realized, quietly, that Ghost Hawk would never truly rest. The name, the instinct, the courage was part of her now, whether she wanted it or not. And perhaps that was fine. For tonight, she had answered the call. She had stepped forward when the world needed her, hidden in plain sight, and brought everyone home. And though the world might never know the full story, she did. And sometimes that was enough. The lights of Denver shimmered in the night sky. Emergency vehicles moved with practiced efficiency. The passengers began to emerge, shaken but alive. And Ghost Hawk, anonymous yet indelibly present, walked quietly into the shadows, her heart still thrumming with the echoes of courage, command, and survival. A legend, unseen and unclaimed, had once again answered the call.